Thank you for pressing start on episode 15 of Underplayed, KZUM's indie video game podcast. Today we have 2 secret games followed by a review of our featured game, Doki Doki Literature Club Plus. Here on Underplayed, we review indie games of all kinds, the games with small budgets but big hearts, the lesser-known experiences with imaginative ideas. I'm Bopo, and joining me is my player 2, DiscoCola. What is up, DiscoCola?
Nothing much, Bopo. We're back in the seat today, and I am tired. How are you?
I am doing just fine. My enthusiastic club president... you are tired because you just had your second child.
Yes, I did. It's not quite the same as the first time around, as it turns out. Apparently, infants can have different temperaments, and I remember talking to you off the air about how I thought, we weren't going to skip a beat here at Underplayed, but we did have to delay this recording a little bit. Just because this child's been much more taxing on my time than the first one.
Sure. Well, congratulations to you and your family. It's a big moment for all of you, and just so happy for all of you.
Yeah.
Glad everybody's healthy.
Yeah.
And good.
Hospital stay, much better.
Awesome.
No extended stay or anything. But
cool.
Yeah. And don't get it twisted. I do still love my child. It just didn't get to play Hollow Knight this time around.
Oh, yes. That would have been quite a task to throw in there. But glad you're able to take a little time away from your family. Thank you so much for doing that. And we'll get you back with your close ones very soon. But in the meantime, we will be reviewing Doki Doki Literature Club Plus today on the podcast. And this is a very interesting game, very unlike many other games we've reviewed on this podcast, very unlike other games that I have played in general.
Mm-hmm.
And you were actually familiar with Doki Doki Literature Club?
Yes, correct. I hadn't played it myself, but I had seen a playthrough from a popular, YouTube duo and saw some other, extra videos about it. So I was pretty familiar with it, having not played it myself.
And I knew very little about the game. I knew it was unconventional in a number of ways, but I didn't know a lot of the story. And so later on in our episode, when we talk about that, I think it'll be interesting to contrast your experience versus mine. I think we'll have a good amount of things to discuss on that very popular visual novel game. I also want to talk about this device that released recently that we've both had our eyes on. This device called the Playdate was released. Could you describe what the Playdate handheld console is?
So the Playdate looks a little bit like the original Game Boy and a little bit like a Game Boy Advance SP, but it also has this cool little crank on the side, and it features just this cool resolution and graphical style that you don't really see in modern technology. It can run really well and does some high quality graphics, but it uses a visual style that you might have seen in home computers in the early to mid 90s, I would say.
Yeah. The screen resolution, I just looked it up, is only 400 by 240 pixels at 173 pixels per inch. So in a lot of ways, it's modern looking, but it's also very retro looking.
Yeah, I'm very into this modern retro stuff.
Yeah, very cool. And the reason we're bringing this up is because this very thing is made for indie games. And the way it's designed is it's kind of open for lots of developers to design for it.
Mm-hmm.
And every week, I think it is, a new game or maybe 2 games come out. They unlock on your system and download, and then you can play a new game. And that is very exciting. I think it'd be cool too if we could eventually get our hands on a Playdate to check out some games, maybe for this podcast. But we'll see. We'll see how things go.
We're looking into that very seriously.
Yeah, that would be really fun. If we're able to get Playdates someday, hey, maybe we could do a whole bonus episode where we just talk about those relatively smaller games that come out on Playdate. So at the time of recording, I think reviews just came out, and a lot of them were very positive that I read. So that was really cool to hear and read about. So without further ado, I think it's time we can move on to our secret games.
The secret games, that you're playing. The secret games,
In this segment, we each review an indie game that we've been playing in secret since our last episode. We don't discuss our picks in advance. We keep them a surprise for this very moment. We can choose any indie game as long as it hasn't been discussed on the podcast before. We'll start with you, DiscoCola. Let the mystery be no more. Reveal your secret game for episode 15 of Underplayed.
My secret game this episode comes from Bubby Darkstar and Aggro Crab, and the game is called Subway Midnight.
I've never heard of this. Okay, so you just sent me the trailer, and looking at this thing, I recognize the name Aggro Crab now, seeing it written out. I've seen these guys on Twitter.
Yeah, they'll definitely be back on another episode of Underplayed. I have one of their other games ready to go for just the right episode.
Okay, I'm not familiar with their gameography.
It's very small, I think. They're only just starting out.
Okay, cool. Well, tell me about Subway Midnight.
All right, Subway Midnight from the Steam store, a haunted house-style spooky cute game set on a ghost-infested train from the mind of Bubby Darkstar. You play mostly as a character named Liz as she explores the different cars of the train, and that's kind of the gist of it. You don't really know where Liz is going or why she's on the train specifically. When the game opens, you're playing as a different character, and she's kind of doing the same thing. At first, the train cars, they all seem normal, but then one of them has you walking on the ceiling. Another one is filling with black ooze. All the while, this ominous creature is slowly trailing behind you. Eventually, this unnamed character reaches a locked train car, and the ominous creature with a glowing, toothy grin catches up to you. And with a loud dun and a cut to black, you begin playing as Liz at the train station. Now, like I alluded to earlier, Liz's true motivation is pretty unclear and probably even unimportant, honestly. But as you're making your way through the train, it becomes apparent, albeit slowly, that your goal is to help a series of spirits find closure or move on or something. This is telegraphed through the ghostly nature and behaviors of said characters and missing persons posters that are littered throughout the train. So that's kind of how you know that these people are dead, I guess. And if you successfully helped said spirits with their needs, you will often be treated to some sort of short cutscene with Liz and the spirit. You help these spirits by essentially doing a series of puzzles or playing some sort of short mini-game in their section of the train. Throughout much of your journey on the train, the creature with the glowing toothy grin is pursuing you or is present in some sort of storytelling of the train cars. So this sort of indicates that the entity sort of ties all these spirits together in some way, likely, as the cause of death somehow. And you can only really uncover these mysteries by playing the game. So I kind of want to go over some things I really like about the game. First and foremost is the art style. This is Bubby Darkstar's signature style, someone I wasn't familiar with before the game. But if you look them up on Twitter, you can find a variety of characters, on his Twitter, sort of drawn in a similar distinctive style, full of really round edges and sharp corners and thick outlines, like you saw in the trailer. You kind of get the vibe of what Bubby Darkstar is going for in his art. This game, more than anything I've ever played, captures the feeling of being in a dream state. This is done by having maybe 2 or 3 train cars in a row that might have slight variations on each other, but then the next one being a totally different setting, tone, shape, and this is the strongest aspect of the creepiness factor in the game. The pacing is really well done in some ways. The player is interested in trying to uncover the mysteries of the story without giving away too much information. The last thing that stood out as being pretty good is action feedback. There aren't a lot of examples of actions in the game other than walking, but when you do perform an action, the sound effects and slight animations give it quite a lot of life. On the flip side of some of those positives are things I don't like quite as much. So on the flip side of the intriguing mystery is a little bit of like confusion when it comes to the rules and the stakes of the game. Like I mentioned in the opening stage, you hear that dun and that dun and that cut to black. So it sort of sets up the idea that your character could die and lose the game. But when you actually start playing as Liz, it's a long time before you find anything unscripted that can even kill you. So I kind of spent just like this uncomfortable amount of time wondering if I was playing a walking sim and the point was to just show me a couple of creepy train cars or cars done in different art styles.
The stakes weren't quite
right
what you expected based on the opening.
Yeah, at least not. It took a while to find those stakes anyways. So I would say that also relates to pacing. In addition to that, it takes a while for you to find a way to actually help the spirits in any way. So I kind of found myself a bit confused about whether the game was linear or not, you know, having met one of the spirits pretty early on, and then meeting her multiple times in between helping other spirits. And so when you enter maybe some train cars that have multiple exits, I got a little bit confused about whether or not the game was linear. And I'm still not totally sure, but I think it is a linear path. The walking speed's a little too slow. The game only took me, according to Steam, about 2.4 hours to get to the end. So it's not long, so you don't really want to breeze through it like it's nothing. But this game has multiple endings, and it moves just a little bit too slow for me to want to go back in and get those other endings myself. But if you can stream it or something, you might be able to be more invested in discovering those secrets with someone. And I think that's the best way to play the game. If I had been able to play this maybe with you, Bopo, I could see us being like both intrigued enough to encourage each other enough to find those secrets that maybe we missed the first time around. So when something wears a cute skin and it can make like creepy elements creepier, which is sort of what I was looking for. But maybe I had the wrong idea about the game, I think. Because I didn't quite find the game as creepy as I had initially hoped. The ISO on everything looks like it's set at like 12,000 or something, and that constant visual distortion is definitely a good start for like a creepy visual. And there are a couple of train cars and one minigame in particular that are like very unsettling or disturbing, which is what I wanted. But I just wanted a lot more of that. So to conclude, this game offers an intriguing mystery that has a fascinating payoff in the multiple endings. I did look up those endings, but did not play them myself. It offers an incredible art direction from Bubby Darkstar, and I hope to see a lot more of that in the future. I've never seen a piece of media reflect the feeling of dreaming better than Subway Midnight, and that includes major Hollywood movies, anything. I think it is the best depiction of dreaming, even though I don't think you're actually dreaming.
Wow.
Like I said, I wish it had been a bit creepier, but I don't think maybe that was the point. So I don't want to take too much off for that. And too many of the cars, they're just mazes. That padded out the game with something that I found annoying at times. I want to give Subway Midnight a 6.5 out of 10 with the disclaimer that I expect to like it more when I play it on better performing hardware.
We talked about, it being fun to play with others. This sounds like something that I would like to visit. If you would be willing to revisit, I'd be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And I think that there is a good reason to do that. At the time of this recording, Subway Midnight's only on PC, but console ports are announced.
Oh.
Google says PS4 and Xbox One,
wow.
But the announcement trailer has a Switch controller in it, so I'm guessing Switch 2. But if I had to guess, those console ports will probably be out before this episode is.
This does seem like a very naturally Switch indie. This feels like an indie that would be announced at an indie land or something.
Absolutely.
For sure. The art style kind of reminds me of that 2D, 3D look that we've talked about on the podcast before, maybe just based on the very limited trailer I'm looking at. That's inaccurate, but it's reminding me of Paper Mario and Bug Fables, which we've talked about, and of this game called Demon Turf, which I've had on my radar for a while. If you're not familiar with that, that's a 3D platformer that probably isn't as dark and unsettling as this game, but I think a lot of the character designs are pretty similar to what Bubby Darkstar does. So maybe look into Demon Turf if you haven't looked into that.
Oh, actually, I do. I am familiar with Demon Turf.
You are? Okay.
Yeah, that also just got a physical announcement, and I watched some gameplay of that pretty recently.
Yeah, and I think they just announced a sequel or a follow-up to that game or something. But wanted to ask you about, with the train construction of the design, is the entire game on the train? Does it cut away from the train in those cutscenes? Is it pretty much like all in this one place, like kind of those movies that take place in one location?
Right. Well, technically, yes, you are all on the train. But have you ever seen the show Infinity Train? Where
you've told me about it. I have not seen it. No.
I mean, technically, everything is a train car, but you have these massive rooms.
Sure.
That contain multiple exits.
And so it doesn't necessarily feel like you're there. Okay.
Like there's one room that's a series of conveyor belts and smashers, but it's still technically a train car.
Gotcha. I was going to ask, does it feel claustrophobic? But maybe it doesn't, since the rooms can tend to get bigger and change design and stuff.
It does, actually, and it has less to do with being in train cars and more to do with the way the camera operates. Because when you're moving forward, the camera pulls back quite a bit, but when you're moving toward the screen, the camera does the opposite and kind of like
pushes in on you.
And you can actually run past the camera pretty easily and sort of like lose track of where you are. That can make things really difficult if you're trying to like backtrack in one of those maze cars that I was talking about.
Okay. Well, it sounds like one I would be willing to check out with you if you're willing to revisit. It's Subway Midnight. That's DiscoCola's secret game. It's time for my secret game. And I don't typically do the thing that you do where I try to find synergy. I do when it is a game I'm really in the mood to play and it happens to have synergy. I'll maybe delay it a few weeks so that I can have it coincide with this featured game that's coming up. And my secret game is called 1979 Revolution Black Friday, and it ended up having more synergy than I thought it would. So it's not like Doki Doki Literature Club in that it's a visual novel, it's not a horror game, but it is a game where it's very narrative driven, where you're making certain choices that affect outcomes later. So it has a little bit of synergy there.
Right. Yeah.
So this is a 2016 interactive drama adventure. It was later ported to more platforms in 2018. It was developed and published by Ink Stories with assistance from Enfusion Interactive. I'll read the game synopsis from the Steam storefront. Quote, 1979 Revolution Black Friday is a choice-driven narrative game that brings players into the brooding world of a nation on the verge of collapse. Play as Reza, an aspiring photojournalist, and make life and death decisions as you survive the gritty streets of Iran in the late 1970s, end quote. So this is a third-person, choice-driven game that really borrows heavily from Telltale games. I don't know if you're familiar with Telltale games. They're typically not considered indie games, but they're pretty popular as narrative games. And this game is different from Telltale games because it's not based on anything that's fictional. It's based on real-world events. It's based on the Iranian Revolution that took place in the late 1970s. I don't know if you know a lot about that time period and that time in history. Did you ever learn about it in school? Did you ever study it closely?
I mean, history was not something that I pursued in school academically, I would say.
Okay. This was an event that I feel like was not really touched upon when I was going through school. I think it was maybe mentioned in history classes. It's never something that I sat down to really study. haven't seen documentaries about it, haven't watched a lot of films about that time period. So I was drawn to 1979 Revolution Black Friday because this game is devoted to portraying that time period and some characters that are based on real people from the time period. So one of the big goals of the revolution was to overthrow the Shah, the monarchy, and to establish a Islamic republic. And it led to Ruhollah Khomeini becoming the supreme leader of Iran. There are some events I'm sure you've heard of, like the Iranian hostage crisis, and this led to the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. And this story jumps between 2 points. You're playing as Reza, this photojournalist, and it takes place primarily during the revolution, but then it jumps forward to the year after the revolution. So the game opens in the flash forward time when Reza is captured by police. The revolution has already taken place, and he's taken to Evin prison where he's questioned about his involvement from the previous 2 years. And then the story jumps back to his first involvement. And when that story jumps back, Reza has just returned to Iran shortly after the revolution has begun, and he needs to kind of catch up to what's going on. He's not familiar with what's happened in his home country, and he meets up with friends and family and new acquaintances throughout this 2 or 3 hour experience. And all these people that Reza interacts with have different roles in the revolution. There's Hussein, who is Reza's brother, who's a member of the Savak, which is the secret police of the Shah. So that creates a lot of friction in Reza's family and among Reza's friends. Then there's a close friend of Reza's called Babak, who supports pacifism, member of the revolution, but doesn't want to fight. And then serving as kind of a foil to Babak, there's Ali, who's Reza's cousin, another revolutionist who supports violence. Then there are some side characters, Bibi, who is a leader of the student protesters of Iran. And then there's the captor in the flash forward time, whose name is Asadollah Lajeverdi, who was a real politician and prosecutor. So actually, many of the characters and story moments are based on true people and events. And as Reza, you have 3 different kinds of gameplay that you experience throughout this game. The first is when you're walking around and exploring and taking pictures of your environment. The second is when you're talking to another character and you're making dialogue choices. They say something to you. You're given 4 different options and a certain amount of time to pick which option you want to say to them. And then they react to what you say. And then the third are quick time events, which are just sprinkled throughout the experience. There are only a handful of those, but times where you need to press a button very quickly because you're in some kind of an action scene. And the big thing you need to do as the player is make decisions about how to act in this revolution, especially as a photojournalist. You need to decide, are you going to be a peaceful or violent protester? Who do you accuse of certain crimes? Do you cooperate with your captor? If given the choice between 2 people, who would you protect? So it gives you a lot of interesting, sometimes good and bad choices, but sometimes gray area choices. And as choices are made, you'll be given notice that certain characters will remember your actions. This is a very telltale thing. You'll say something to Bibi, and she'll say, or you'll get a notification up in the corner that says, Bibi won't forget that, or Ali will remember that. Reza's big role is to document events through photographs, and as you do so, you collect these stories that tell various aspects of politics and religion and culture from the time, and you can read those at any time in the pause menu, and they're in a submenu called Stories, I believe. So the whole time you're collecting real information about the world, and if you want to do extracurricular reading, you can go in and learn even more about the revolution and Iran at the time. What I liked about this game is it's the most interactive and accessible way I've been able to absorb this part of history. I mentioned this isn't something I ever learned in depth in school. And though it focuses on specific times, places, and characters, the way information is doled out feels very grand and holistic. You feel like you're this small piece in a large historic event, and the game communicates that this country and its events are very big, even if it can't show you the actual scale at all times. But the game is not just educational. There's a good variety with gameplay. And I think there's the right amounts of each kind. You might be walking around in one chapter, taking pictures. The next chapter, you might be making dialogue choices. And then you might be in more of an action scene the next. Those action scenes do have quick time events. Those might be a turnoff for a lot of people, but there are only 4 of them in the entire game, 4 moments where you're doing that. So they feel really disciplined while still adding tension to those moments when you're in a scuffle. And the game is very short. It's only 2 hours, but in that time, you do see a lot. There are 19 chapters, each taking place at different times with various side characters. Most chapters last anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes or so. So they feel very digestible, and you're constantly moving. It feels like the game is constantly wanting to show you something new. And I'll also add, since this is a story-driven game with lots of characters talking to each other, the performances, thankfully, are really great. The action is motion captured. The actors give a lot of emotion to their performances. Some of the dislikes I had with this, the photography sections can feel a little clumsy when you're walking around on the streets, pulling out that camera. It changes the view to first person, and you're looking through a camera viewfinder, and you can point it around. And the pointing that around feels herky-jerky. It feels it's not quite fine-tuned. At least it wasn't on.
Stabilizers weren't invented yet, Popo.
Right. More gimbals, please. No, but I wish I could fine-tune where I'm pointing the camera a little bit easier without, clicking the stick back and forth. And there's a focus meter that it's basically a meter along the bottom of the frame. And there's a bar that runs left and right. Kind of like when you play a golf mini game.
Oh, yeah. I know what you're talking
when
about.
the bar reaches the center, the picture you're about to take, if you snap the shot while that meter hits in the center, it's going to be completely in focus. And if you miss that center window, it's out of focus. But the focus actually doesn't matter. If you take the photo blurry, it's still going to add the story to your journal. It's still going to count toward the achievement/trophy for taking all the photos of all the landmarks and stuff. So it just didn't need to be there. It's a little unnecessary. With Reza foremost being a photographer, I wish the game would let me enjoy that part more, or just make that part of the game less, I don't know.
Arbitrary?
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that I didn't like is that the promise of seeing the outcome of your choices really isn't fulfilled in this game. But this isn't the game's fault, and this is a rare criticism because this isn't something that they could have easily changed. My understanding, based on my research of this game, is that it was going to be episodic in nature. It was going to be even more like Telltale games in the way that those games have a chapter 1 that lasts 2 hours, and then there's a chapter 2 that lasts 2 or 3 hours, and then a chapter 3, and so on, maybe up to half a dozen chapters. And decisions you make in chapter 1 might affect things that happen in chapter 5. And when you get the notification that a certain character will remember something, you might not see that outcome until a successive chapter, not even within the chapter you're playing. This game only has 1 chapter. They originally wanted to have several, maybe up to 9 or 10 entire chapters of this game. And so the choices that allow you to plant seeds don't have a chance to grow. You don't get to see what BB truly thinks of you after you said this thing to her, or you don't get to see how this character is upset with you for being violent or for being a pacifist. So the story feels a little truncated and hurried in a way, but I realized that original intent of the design. I just wish I could have seen it realized. And then one other tiny thing I would add is that the timer to select dialogue options is a little bit too short. I found that when a character would say something to me and then my 4 options would show up, that timer running out would just be a couple seconds too short. I was often finishing reading all my options with only like 1 second left to choose. And I wish I could have more carefully considered what I was about to say. But overall, 1979 Revolution Black Friday is a game I respect. It has ambitions to portray real-world events in a style that's familiar to a lot of gamers. The story had a lot of places it could have gone, and I wish I could have seen at least several more chapters like what I played. So for now, this kind of feels limited, but it still allowed me to come away with knowledge about religious, political, and cultural happenings of the time. So I would recommend this to Telltale fans who want something a little different. And I rate this game a 7 out of 10.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the questions that I have, or maybe just a comment, is that the way you described it sort of sounds to me like the best way to make the video game version of a documentary.
Yeah.
Other than just being like something that you read or listen to with a nice voice or something. Is that something that you would agree with? Like,
absolutely. I think this is a very successful way to portray maybe not a lot of specific happenings of the revolution, but to just portray what it was like to be there in that time, in that moment. The game director, Naveed Khansari, he was a child in Iran at the time of the revolution, and he specifically wanted to make a game that depicts the moral gray areas of the situation. As we look at a lot of these revolutions and wars and events in history as this idea of good versus bad or right versus wrong. And this game shows you that objectively, there aren't a lot of right or just or correct things that happened at the time. And so I thought that was really eye-opening. So I think the power of documentary through gaming allowed me to see that in a way that a traditional documentary might not have been able to.
Okay.
Because it's putting you in that tough situation of, hey, make this decision, make it now, time's running out. And maybe that short time to make certain dialogue choices, maybe that's reinforcing that. I just wish some of those things I wish I could have had a little more time to consider, but you don't always get that in real life.
Right, I guess not. Another question I have, and maybe this is too big for Underplayed, I imagine it's hard to know all the time that you're in a revolution until it's over and your goals are achieved or something like that. Our own nation state's kind of seen a lot of tumult lately. Do you see a lot of parallels from what unfolds in this game and what's happening in our own culture that we're a part of?
Yeah, this game was developed several years ago. It was in development for like 4 years. So I think they started working on this around 2011, 2012. But I think you could pick any time from the past 1 or 2 decades and find parallels to this game as far as like what's happening in our country versus Iran in the late 70s. But it had a little bit of a personal impact for me seeing those parallels in the moment I was playing it, but I was mostly absorbed with this experience because I was in the mode of learning about something that I didn't have this access to in a way before. So I was actually going into the pause menu and I was reading about the different kinds of protesters, the different factions of revolutionists. They didn't all have the same political and cultural ambitions. So it was interesting to read about that stuff. And you're just getting general cultural, political, and religious information. I just learned a lot from this game, and I really appreciated that. I think it's definitely the game so far in Underplayed that allowed me to learn about real world things more so than anything else.
Yeah. Would you play more games like this?
I would. I definitely would. I haven't looked into Ink Stories and if they have worked on anything else, but I would definitely play another game like this because the traditional history textbook or history documentary sometimes doesn't appeal to me.
Same.
Like this. So again, I rate that a 7 out of 10, and it is playable on PC, Mac, iOS, Android, PlayStation 4, which is how I played it, Nintendo Switch, and Xbox One. So it's in a
lot of places.
Variety of places. Those are our secret games, Subway Midnight and 1979 Revolution Black Friday. Let's move on to our review of Doki Doki Literature Club Plus. It is our featured game. So Doki Doki Literature Club Plus is a 2021 romance adventure, psychological horror visual novel. The original version of this game was Doki Doki Literature Club, and that came out in 2017. And it was developed by Dan Salvato and Team Salvato for the Plus version, published by Serenity Forge for the Plus version. So the first iteration of this game, Doki Doki Literature Club, was just Dan working on it, I believe, or Dan and a very small team.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm going to read the game synopsis from the Steam storefront. Quote, "Welcome to the club. Write poems for your crush and experience the terror of school romance in this critically acclaimed psychological horror story." End quote. So this game is easiest to describe as a visual novel because I think gamers understand that concept of having limited gameplay, reading a lot of text, seeing character sprites on screen who are talking to you. They're kind of centered and you're just reading text bubbles, sometimes hearing voiceover.
Mm-hmm.
How else would you describe the hallmarks of visual novels?
Branching paths based on relationships you decide to pursue. They're typically romantic, not always, but typically romantic and conclude in different ways based on what romantic choices you make.
Right. They're often dating simulators, kind of a subgenre of visual novels. And a lot of the art for this subgenre tends to lean on detailed backgrounds and characters that are illustrated with a Japanese style. Sometimes as the player, you aren't seen or heard. I'd actually say that's probably more common, right?
Yeah, most of the time, I would say you're more of a silent protagonist and your only input are just those different options that maybe change outcomes.
Right. And sometimes the options aren't even different dialogue options. They're just making a choice like, I want to hang out with this character.
Right.
You're not even like in a dialogue moment at that time. So personally, I have not played any visual novel other than Doki Doki Literature Club.
Yeah,
Have you?
No, not really.
So what this game does is it leans on those tropes of the subgenre. But then what it does is it deconstructs them. It does really wild, crazy, horrific, unsettling things. And the Plus version of this game actually gives some trigger warnings ahead of the game to warn people who maybe are not familiar with what this game is about. It warns you about some things. So I was thinking about whether to talk about that specifically, but I'll just say that there are trigger warnings. And if you haven't played this game and you want to know more about that, maybe read what the game has to say to you about that. And I would also say that this game is very fragile with spoilers. And as we get further into this discussion, it's going to be hard to talk about this without spoiling some kind of big ideas. We're not going to spoil every single thing about this game, but it's really hard to dance around this stuff. So I would encourage players to check this out. Make sure you know, if you feel like you want to read those trigger warnings, make sure you read about that before you delve into the experience. And otherwise, you can keep listening. Would you add anything to that?
No, I was very careful with my thoughts, putting it down on paper to make sure that I don't reveal any plot points, and I don't think I'll spoil much of anything until we get to just that sort of end discussion where we're asking each other questions about DDLC Plus.
Okay, cool. And then the only other thing I wanted to do before talking about the story at an overview level is just touch on some differences between the original and Plus. We are reviewing Plus foremost on this episode, but the original game from 2017, as I understand, didn't have some bonus content from Plus like the side stories, didn't have what I will vaguely call the computer feature.
Correct.
And didn't have the HD visuals and some of the newer sprites and backgrounds. There are more music tracks in Plus. Any other differences that I'm missing?
Other than stuff that might spoil sort of the big ideas that you were alluding to earlier, I think that's it.
Okay, cool. So we can maybe touch on that a little bit further on. So in this game, you play as a high school student who has a childhood friend named Sayori, And Sayori meets you in the morning and invites you to join your high school's literature club, which you agree to do, maybe a little reluctantly. And the club has 4 other members when you join, including Sayori. So in addition to her, there is Natsuki, who is hot-tempered and full of energy. There's Yuri, who is shy and intelligent. And then there's Monica, who is popular, athletic, seemingly very successful, and who also serves as the club president. And shortly after you join this club, you start learning the quirks about all of them, what makes each of them tick. You become tasked with writing a poem each night. Monica gives everybody an assignment to write a poem, and then come the next day, we'll share our poems with each other, and we'll talk about what, how they make us feel. And that night you go home and you can pick a word to slot into the poem, one word at a time. You're not seeing a whole poem written out. You're just choosing between, I think it's 20 words. Or
Yeah,
no, you're choosing between a handful of words what your poem is going to be based on. And you pick 20 total words.
Yes.
And each word corresponds to the intellectual tastes of one of the club members. So Sayori likes really romantic, bittersweet words. Natsuki likes cute, innocent words. And Yuri likes brooding and complex words.
Yes.
Some things I'm describing vaguely for the sake of spoilers. The next day, everyone will share those poems. You get different reactions depending on what words you choose. And then those are the primary choices, I feel, that lead to events with certain characters and various endings. That is how I would pitch this game without saying anything more to somebody who hasn't played Doki Doki Literature Club. So
yeah, it's a bit of a longer elevator pitch than we usually have. It's a
it would
little difficult.
It would take a few elevator rides to describe that to somebody, but maybe not as long as the Outer Wilds elevator pitch that I had to do for that one. So, as we mentioned up top, you were familiar with this story somewhat because you kind of delved into some online content, learning about what the mysteries of this game are. You've seen playthroughs and stuff. I had not done that at all. I just knew that this game did horrific, unsettling, crazy, out of left field things. I didn't know what those things were.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we differ a little bit. So now I'm curious, having known the story of Doki Doki Literature Club and now delving into Plus and seeing the new version and playing through it yourself, what do you think about this experience?
Well, first of all, I want to start by saying, I'm not really a big reader. I've said before on this podcast,
You don't like history books, I know from our last section.
I don't have a MacArthur grant or anything, but I'm not stupid. But when it comes to reading comprehension, though, I've always struggled a bit more with that than other academic activities, which probably is why I don't like history books, less because of the history, more because of the just dry reading it involves. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that I don't really like the idea of a visual novel. But I like this game a lot. It really successfully uses cliche anime tropes and character archetypes to create this sense of security in the cliches. And even if you're familiar with it, you still get invested in those cliches, even if you know what's coming. So yeah, just when that game adds the depth to those characters and a sense of direction to the game, that Act 1 ending just pulls it all from under you. And it's such an impactful moment that in any other game might just be a shock factor gimmick or just totally out of nowhere. And it still has a little bit of that, I think, in this game, but it doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel unearned, I would say. So then on top of that, the game adds this extra and entirely different realm of gameplay on top of a visual novel game, and it's so cool. So while I knew all of the major beats of the game before going into it, for myself, I still felt some of that same awe that I felt when I watched someone else play it back in 2017.
Wow.
Yeah. I kept thinking about a lot of the things that you said during the Before Your Eyes episode and how I felt a lot of those sentiments myself for Doki Doki Literature Club and still a little bit for Doki Doki Literature Club Plus. even though some of those changes alter the way that feels as a payoff. So while I'm sure there probably were some games before that performed this big idea that I'm alluding to without spoiling the game, it's like a really unique gameplay element, and if it wasn't the first game that did it, I didn't know about any before it, and it really pioneered sort of using that as a gameplay mechanic, and opened the door for a lot of really cool games since then. And none of that is to even mention like the writing of the characters, which I also think is really great. Some of the characters feel like one-dimensional at times, but that also kind of feels on purpose.
Yeah, it feels by design.
Yeah, especially when you start exploring the side stories. And the deeper subjects that are portrayed here in the game, the writing feels really authentic in most cases. I think some of it might come from a lack of experience in those realms, but there are definitely some of the deeper subjects here that I'm like, I won't say relate to, but I recognize as being very authentic, as if Dan Salvato probably lived, the same feelings as some of the characters. So yeah, I love all the characters, well, except for the character you play as. I think everyone can agree that the character you play as is pretty much uninteresting in every way, but it's so cool because each character is different enough that everyone might have a different favorite. Our friend who played this a couple months ago, he might find Natsuki to be abhorrent and awful, whereas I kind of like her fine. And maybe your favorite's Sayori. Everybody has a different favorite, and it's not necessarily just because of who they find the cutest.
Right.
There is strong enough, right?
Yes.
There's strong enough writing to have a favorite based on that as well. And then, on top of even all of that, the Plus version has a part of the game that flexes character writing even more. And then it adds story elements to the other style of gameplay as you work through the Plus stuff. There's just so much to unlock as you're unlocking stuff. It's just this like cascade of fascinating story in so many different ways. And it's hard to explain what I mean by that without spoiling it, but it's great. Other than doing more reading than I would like to personally in most cases, the only other gripes I have are that the characters are actually a little bit too mature for their age. I'm thinking mainly of Sayori and Yuri.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about you, but like when I was a teenager and all the teenagers I knew were not quite so understanding of their own emotions and the impacts that those emotions have on their actions.
Sure.
Let alone being forthcoming and upfront about those kinds of things. However, I will qualify that by saying I've noticed in recent years that like the generation that's up behind us has a little bit better emotional maturity. At least that's my perception.
Sure.
So maybe that's not out of place anymore, but I felt like they didn't seem like teenagers. They seemed like maybe they were 24 or something.
Okay.
I don't know.
Sure. Or had just left high school, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And additionally, if you're someone that literally wants to see every small piece of script run across your screen, you're kind of in for a ton of playthroughs, or at least juggling a lot of different saves at the same time, just because there are small choices that might give you like one extra line of text, something along the lines of, I guess I told Natsuki I would share with her today. And so that only happens when you pick Natsuki first on that specific day.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of little things like
For
that.
completionists like you, there's a lot to keep in mind and remember.
Yeah, I found out that there's even more with some of the Plus stuff today when I was doing a little bit of research.
Yeah, because like the Platinum by itself makes you do a lot of different combinations of things. But I could totally understand if there was even more beyond that.
Yeah. Just not much, and you don't need it. But if you're just like, I want to see if I can hit the skip button and actually skip through literally everything.
The whole thing, yeah. True speed run.
My last gripe, and it's not necessarily a fair one, is that the game is still like mostly a visual novel. That's not a genre that someone like me will typically get behind.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you said for Bug Fables.
Yes.
The turn-based RPG thing just not being your thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so
As it turns out.
which is a you problem.
Yeah.
Not
exactly.
the game problem, but it is a problem. So,
But yeah, all that being said, this game is an incredible pioneer in 2 different genres, and I've already witnessed it influencing a bunch of other fascinating games, including a couple that have already been on Underplayed. I give this game a 9.5 out of 10.
Wowzers, Bowsers. I was not expecting you to go that high with this. Whoa.
Yeah, dude. I mean, I won't say a lot of that has to do with just that awe from the original, but I still felt really great playing DDLC Plus, even though I knew what was coming.
Okay, well, in you talking about it, you've actually made me reflect on some of the things I did appreciate about the game that I might not have in my notes, but I do echo a lot of the things you said about the great writing, about the characters being distinct, about the game being, surprising and having this extra element of gameplay and choice and more layers to it than you might expect with experience like this, even if you're told, hey, this is a deconstruction of the visual novel genre. There's more to this that you just can't really expect because it's so hard to imagine all this stuff. So I am just kind of in awe that this came from, largely one guy coming up with all this based on his experiences with anime and visual novels and taking those conventions and then twisting them again and again. I will say that this game is wild. It has many layers that are memorable, but overall the style of experience just isn't for me. What I did enjoy is that this attempts things very few other games have. It uses its visual novel trappings to show images in a way that few other genres could do so effectively. And this goes back to your point about earning things.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it earns moments because of the time it takes to plant seeds and then you watch them grow, but also just because of visually what the visual novel allows us to see. It makes some moments hit with an impact that I feel like you wouldn't get in a first-person adventure game or any kind of other game, really. I was expecting a completely passive experience with this being a visual novel, but choosing the poem words actually makes you think about what each girl would favor, and I actually enjoyed that. I liked looking at the list and thinking, okay, I'm going to try to write something that's appealing to Yuri, so I'm going to try to find the complex words or the dark, brooding words, and you learn a little bit through trial and error. And the game communicates what each girl likes very simply. I like that simple communication. I love when games communicate sometimes a complex idea in a simple way, just using their little avatars bouncing up and down when you pick their word. I really liked that. And this poem minigame goes a step beyond what a lot of standard visual novels do, where you would just simply pick who you want to hang out with. So I like that it took that extra step to make it more interactive. And then things eventually start to feel out of place, and there's some weird juxtapositions that start to happen. And you start to hear, or you start to read some really sus lines, I'll say. And then the way characters talk slowly devolves into strangeness. And I found that I actually became desensitized to some of the strangeness. As they start saying certain lines, I started to become used to that. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, we're getting into Crazy Town now. And like, this is how the game is. Okay, I got it. And then there are meta moments. There are moments like, this is a spoiler, so skip ahead or stop and pause, play the game if you need to. I'm giving you time to pause. Meta moments like Monica telling me to save my game.
Yeah.
That gave me chills down my spine. I did not expect that. And in a couple of scenarios, the game made me change my real world habits or made me do things in the real world that other games have not done. Like, I had to put the controller down and check Twitter. I had to look something up on Twitter. I've never had to do that for a game before. And then there are chilling and haunting moments. There is a moment where you spend an entire weekend doing something.
Yep.
And that moment will stick with me for a long, long time. I love the way this game juxtaposes things, taking the sappy music that you'd hear in visual novels and putting a strange line of dialogue against that, or taking the sappy music and altering it to be disturbing. And I think that's a big addition with Plus, from what I understand, is that some of the additional bonus music tracks are those iterations of some of the base game tracks to sound a little off. This game defies typical story structure in almost every way. It's really hard to know what to expect or how much of the game you have left, which, depending on your energy level, could be a con for you. A big like I have for this game is the developer note you get when you earn the true ending. I think it's just so beautifully written, and it talks about Dan Salvato's philosophy on not just this game, but on games in general. So I found that to be really cool and unexpectedly beautiful. Some things that I didn't appreciate about Doki Doki Literature Club Plus is that while it does give you some interactive moments with making the poems, the overall experience is still just a bit too passive of an experience. The reading part is not something that I seek and enjoy as much, and it is a genre problem. It's a me problem. It's not necessarily a game problem. While the music is really cool to me when it's juxtaposed against strange dialogue moments or when the music is iterated upon, the repetition of the sappy music really got to me, and I had to tune it out because I was tired of listening to it. And the game does take a while to reveal the weirdness going on, but the whole time when it's not weird, I am aware something wrong will happen because of the reputation this game has, even if it's a very vague reputation and I don't know the specifics. I felt like that distracted me from focusing a lot of times. I was going out of my way to look for that strangeness to happen. Like, when is it going to get weird? When is it going to get weird? And I wish I could have almost gone into this completely, absolutely fresh and unsullied. But I understand too, with the content that this game has, that that's hard to do and not give the player a trigger warning.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, you're purchasing a game that was rated by the ESRB. So like,
yes,
you have to know
something's up. You have to know it's M rated.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that, again, is not necessarily a game problem. It's just unfortunately, our world works this way. And so I have to visit this game with this prior knowledge. And I just wish I could be more unsullied. There are some layers to the story that have some really interesting world building that I feel like is hinted at, but I wanted more depth with. And I'm talking specifically about, in the Plus version, there's the computer system, and you get access to these emails, and you see interactions between these people from Metaverse Enterprise Solutions. I'm not going to say anything more, but I feel like there's a whole world there, and I want to know more about that. And maybe there will be another game or another version at some point where we can know more about that. But it reminded me of Aperture Science from Portal in a way. There's something there, and maybe that's the allure of this game, is that we can never know about it and we just have to imagine it ourselves. But I wish it could be told to me. And this is such a confounding thing to say, but I feel like this game ends in a way that feels endless, but it also feels like it ends too soon at the same time because of how abruptly you can end the experience, but also because of the idea of what the game is before you end the experience. It feels like this eternal thing. So I don't know if that's necessarily a dislike or a like. It's more of an observation. So overall, Doki Doki Literature Club Plus, as you could probably tell from my rambling, it's a really hard game to describe. It has shocking moments that are very memorable. I love Dan Salvato's philosophy behind this game and behind gaming. The game has trappings that allow us a gateway to an unconventional experience, but they're trappings I don't really enjoy much naturally. So I'm going to score this game quite a bit lower than you. I would give this a 6 out of 10.
Oh, dang.
Yeah.
That's too bad.
So maybe the widest delta between our scores on a featured game?
Maybe since Before Your Eyes.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I gave that an 8.5 and you gave it a 7.
It might
6.5.
It might have even been like
I think it was a 7.
Was it?
I think it
feel
was.
like
I think you were
lower.
talking about 6.5, but then you said 7 seems fair
Yeah.
for that. But yeah, it's so different of an experience that it's really hard to score it for me, though. I thought about scoring it a 5.5. I thought about scoring it a 7. I thought about scoring it a 7.5. So what I'm arriving at with a 6 is still a positive score, still overall an experience I will remember, still an experience I'm glad I had, just not an experience that moment to moment was always my favorite thing to do.
Well, that's true. I feel the same way, especially trying to read a screen while holding a baby at 2 a.m. It's your eyes hurt. Just like Before Your Eyes.
Yes, exactly. So what blew my mind was something you messaged me earlier, and I actually learned about it just like an hour before you told me. But I learned it today. The discovery that on the original version.
Oh, are we doing like full spoilers now, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're gonna do that. So
okay, guys.
by now, if you haven't played this game, you should have clicked away, hopefully. But the discovery that on the original version, you actually had to navigate to the location of the main executable file on your computer to do something. And again, I'm not even like saying what you're doing, right? So it's not like a full spoiler, but this game is making you interact with your computer in a different way.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that? Is that something you've ever seen, or is that something you wish was replicated somehow in the Plus version for consoles?
Well, I think they do a good job of replicating it the best that they can on consoles by adding what you called the computer function. I can't imagine any other possible way to do that. Although, and maybe we can wait till later, I did have a fascinating instance with our weekend activity that really took me by surprise, and I can go into that a little bit later if we don't want to talk about it now. It's a little spoilery, but
okay.
Yeah, I also wish that I could have played the original, because I think that's such a cool thing. I like when games can not only surprise you by doing something unexpected, and like I, talked about in my general thoughts, like I hadn't seen another game do that up to that point. I'm sure that like playing with files was something that has happened before. But I hadn't seen it. It took me by surprise. It was such a cool thing to see unfold in front of me. And there's so much more than just the like very basic file that we're specifically talking about. There's so many different Easter eggs when you navigate to that folder at different points in the game, and it's different. It's in a different state at different points in the game. According to Dan Salvato and the website, all of that stuff is in the Plus version at different times. It just doesn't have the same feeling because it still feels like it's within the realm of the game instead of something outside of the game that's being affected by the game.
Yeah. I played this on console, played the Plus version on console, did the whole interactive thing, the meta thing where you change the files and stuff. And this revelation that this is how the original version was still such a kind of light bulb surprise thing.
Good.
Didn't ever occur to me that could be a possibility for the original version. Didn't have a reason to think about that. So I think that is super cool. I think there have been games that break the fourth wall in a lot of ways that reference, messing with your memory card. Like there's the Psycho Mantis boss fight from MGS.
Yeah, when I wrote my notes, that was like the only thing I could think of that was anything like that beforehand.
There was also a game called Eternal Darkness.
One of the Mega Mans gives you an extra boss if you have a certain save on your memory card.
Yes, that kind of thing. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem was a horror game on like the GameCube that I never played, but I've heard about it, and it used to taunt you in the same way that like Psycho Mantis would, you know, so there's that kind of stuff out there. I'm sure you're right that there are other games that have done this kind of thing. There were very small details that would often unsettle me in this game.
Okay.
There's the big moments, like the second weekend, the end of the first act, for sure, the entire third act and what you have to do there. Big moments like that that really made an impact, but also just the little details can make an impact too. And I'm thinking of specifically when I was, for a trophy, needing to reload a save over and over to try to trigger something to happen that has a very low success rate of happening.
Oh, yep.
Do you know what I'm talking about? You get a loading screen that just lasts a few seconds, and you get a little note, and often the note says, this game is not suitable for children or those who are easily disturbed. But then that line will change into other things. I noticed one of the times it said, this game is not suitable for children or those who are easily dismembered.
Yeah.
And I did a double take. I was like, wait, what? And now
that same one gave me a double take.
And now every time I read that loading screen, I am hyper-focused on every word to see if anything changed. Sometimes the whole thing changes. So did you have any memories of small details that gave you chills or made you perk up and become disturbed in a way?
I mean, yes. You talked about Monica telling you to save your game. That was one of them. One of her poems actually plants a seed for later too, which, you know, when you think back to it, it's like, oh, yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
I know what you're talking about.
Stuff like that. Stuff inside the computer, just like the computer section. You know, there's just cool little Easter eggs that you find in those emails that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're just all over the place, but you don't always pick up on them until you know like the ultimate conclusion of the game.
Mm-hmm. Right. I was thinking about games that would synergize well with this that I have played. And one example would be this game called Pony Island. I won't spoil anything about that game, but that game has very innocent trappings, and it ends up being a very psychologically horrific experience that I recommend.
If we're recommending other kinds of media, Madoka Magica kind of pulls the same tricks.
You told me about that anime.
I'm sure I have. I love it.
Okay. And that one came out fairly recently as a time of recording, right? 2015. Okay.
I think.
And then actually Undertale, not as demented and horrific and traumatizing, but the same kind of a deconstruction and a lot of unexpected things with that experience too. The only other thing I had written down was just this true ending letter from the developer. I just wanted to go back to this if I could.
Okay.
So Dan Salvato writes this note, specifically these lines. Everyone likes different kinds of games. People who enjoy dating sims may have a heightened empathy for fictional characters, or they might be experiencing feelings that life has not been kind enough to offer them. If they are enjoying themselves, then that's all that matters. That goes for shooting games, casual games, sandbox games, anything. Preferences are preferences, and our differences are the reason we have a thriving video game industry. My own favorite games have always been ones that challenge the status quo. Even if not a masterpiece, any game that attempts something wildly different may earn a special place in my heart. Anything that further pushes the limitless bounds of interactive media. I extend my true gratitude to all those who have taken the time to achieve full completion. He goes on to say thank you and all the love. I just love all that. I didn't expect to read that from the developer.
Well, I mean, just hearing a lot of those words, that's kind of why we're here.
Yeah. I remember reading that and thinking, a lot of this sounds like the mission statement for our podcast.
Yeah.
And I think that's admirable. Anyway, I just wanted to share about that.
All right. Bopo, I have a question for you before we start to wrap up the classroom and head home for the weekend.
To write our poems.
Yeah.
Or, it's the weekend?
Oh,
something bad's going to happen.
We're going to bake with somebody.
Right. Or make decorations.
All right, Bopo. Who is best girl?
I think Yuri.
Okay.
I feel like Yuri is the most like me when I was in high school. So I just kind of felt myself identifying with her personality, her temperament,
Okay.
more so than any of the others. And so I just felt like I had a lot in common with her. So
All right.
that's my answer. Is that acceptable?
Preferences are preferences, Bo. Well, my favorite is easily Sayori. I love her a lot.
Oh, yeah. She's sweet.
Yeah.
She's sweet.
I've always been sort of like a sucker for the girl next door trope kind of a thing anyway.
Yeah.
But in general, I like her. And that the love for like the bittersweet also resonates with me more now than maybe it used to.
It took me a while to identify those words and that's what she was attracted to, because I thought she was into the more bubbly words that Natsuki likes. And I had a hard time figuring out the differences between those two. But then I think, I had to do a couple playthroughs for all the trophies and stuff. And then I started to identify, oh, it's a little bit more complex than you might think.
Yeah.
Because when you first talk to her, she's very bubbly. She's all positive. She wants to, be your best friend, and she's your childhood friend. So you have this deep connection already.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I did a little bit more digging into like a lot of the words that are available. And I think her pool of words has two purposes. One, to show the depth of her character versus maybe the other two, or at least the extent of that relationship. But also, she just has more words, and it's harder to decide which words are hers. And so I think that's sort of a way that the game tricks you into finding yourself pursuing Sayori. Just because she has more words available to her.
Interesting.
And it's harder to discern some of those between the other two. Just because that's a theory of mine just based on how Act 1 ends.
Yeah, and as this is kind of a theory thing, but being her childhood friend and knowing her for so many more years, so much longer than the other three new acquaintances, you would kind of implicitly write down words that you might associate to her without meaning to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know. That would be something you just naturally do if you knew somebody that long.
Right.
All right. Well, should we end there? Is that anything else you want to say about Doki Doki Literature Club Plus? We ended up talking about it more and had more things to say about it than I thought we might at first.
Yeah, it's something that you can't imagine having a spoiler-free conversation about. And there's still more I want to talk to you about off the podcast, just based on a couple of small things that happened to me. But
yeah. Oh, yeah. And you said that you had an experience about one of the weekend events.
Yes. So we spend a weekend at school in the second act. And
traumatizing.
Yes.
Just absolutely brutal.
There's a trophy tied to it also.
Oh, I know. I did that trophy.
Did you?
Oh, I did. I got the platinum.
You probably didn't experience the same thing as me then if you're not already aware of what I'm about to say.
Did you do some like Hollow Knight grub glitch in this game too?
I didn't do jack. The game did it to me. The game crashed on Monday morning twice.
Oh no.
Twice. But it forced me to learn something very interesting. And that is first of all, if you get to that point, all of your saves, if you have multiple saves,
they're gone.
They're gone.
Yes.
It starts at that point.
Yes.
But if you keep reloading saves, it skips from morning to evening to night to the next morning to evening to night. So I was able to overcome the game crashing twice.
Interesting.
By reloading saves, which is such a weird. Why would a save do that? That's so weird. So I wondered.
That has to be by design.
I thought it was, but it didn't happen to you. It didn't happen when I pressed skip, and it didn't happen.
Well, I didn't try to reload saves at that specific point.
Right. But when I was trying to do it without pressing skip, it always crashed on Monday morning.
Wow.
So that didn't happen to you.
No, that part didn't. I thought you meant the reloading saves.
No.
Switching
the game
time.
did not crash on you.
No, it did not.
I wondered if that was by design. It would fit.
It would. That's the fortunate defense this game can make if it acts any strangely towards you. I also want to add real quick, I looked on YouTube for playthroughs of this game, and Dan Salvato has a 3-part developer commentary playthrough. I don't think it was uploaded by him. I think it was somebody who recorded one of his streams. But you can watch Dan Salvato playing not Plus, but the original Doki Doki Literature Club on PC. And this is from like 2018 when he did this.
Cool.
And it's like 3 or 4 hours for each part. So it's a good, 10 to 12 hours of content of watching him play. Yeah. And I watched about half an hour and I got some really cool insights into his philosophy behind how to write the main character, to make the main character this very generic, different voice depending on who he's talking to at any moment, on purpose to kind of make this character be this like amalgamation of personalities so that the character makes sense at all times. And that also because that is a trope in visual novels.
Right.
So you get to hear him pick his own brain about this stuff. So I recommend checking that out. I'll probably check out more of that soon.
Cool. Yeah, I'll check that out myself. But yeah, I liked the Plus version of this game more than I thought that I would, given the impossibility of replicating the original. So
sure.
That's my closing statement.
That's a great testament to how much you love this. That's our review of Doki Doki Literature Club Plus. You can play it on PC, Mac, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X and S. DiscoCola rated it a 9.5. I rated it a 6. That's the end of this episode of Underplayed. You can find more of our episodes at kzum.org/underplayed and on common podcast services like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Our music was composed by Jack Rodenberg. Our art comes from Onimochi. Underplayed is on Twitter at underplayedpod. You can find me on Twitter at Bopo, that's BO_PO, and check out that same handle on the GG app where you can see my game lists and what I'm currently playing.
And I am at DiscoCola on Twitch, on a break for now with an infant, and also for now still on Twitter, but chatting with Monica at the very least.
Jealous. Next time we'll have 2 more secret games, and our featured review will cover Celeste, a platformer developed by Extremely OK Games. Until then, everyone, keep on playing.